Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR tutorial series, where you learn by watching other VR, AR, and MR professionals create the magic. I'm Marcelo Lewin, an immersive technologies evangelist, creator, producer, and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest creator today is Kirby Shibaga, an AR and VR creator who enjoys listening to customers, identifying pain points, and working through the ideation process with diverse teams to prototype and solve business problems. Today, Kirby will be showing us how to build a spawner in Amazon Sumerian. Before we get started, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to my channel. It will only take you a second, but the more subscribers I have, the easier it will be for me to get great guest creators just like Kirby. All right, Kirby, welcome to the tutorial series.
Hi, good morning.
I'm glad to have you here. I met you through the Sumerian Slack channel, which, by the way, if you're learning about Sumerian or getting into Sumerian, you definitely want to subscribe to that channel. It's a great Slack channel where you get to meet people like Kirby and actually work directly with the development team of Sumerian too. So
absolutely, it's kind of the number one resource for Sumerian.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for being here and doing this tutorial. I think it's going to be a great thing to learn how to create a spawner. Before we jump into that, give us a little bit about your background. How did you get into Sumerian, into VR, and all that stuff?
I first got into VR actually before the HTC Vive came to market. I had an opportunity to go over to the Valve office and go through some demos, about half an hour experience with a prototype Vive. It kind of blew my mind. I could definitely see this becoming a future platform that would be very important. And since then, I've been a VR enthusiast. My background from work with that was with the Boeing company, doing some prototype development using Unity and the Vive, and a little bit actually with Samsung Gear VR as well. One thing that I really like with Sumerian is that there's basically very low barrier to entry. Anybody who has an internet connection and a laptop or a desktop machine can get in and start learning the fundamentals of 3D and AR and VR.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that attracted me to Sumerian, and by the way, this is not a paid commercial by Amazon whatsoever. I mean, I've got a good relationship with those guys, but just because they're super cool guys and they're creating something that I'm passionate about, which is VR and bringing it to the masses. But one of the things that I personally like, because I'm really focused on the enterprise, is the fact that it connects with a bunch of AWS services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Today, you're going to show us how to create a spawner. For those that don't know what a spawner is, it sounds like a science fiction movie that it's going to come out of your stomach or something. So can you explain what a spawner is?
Sure. So the basic idea is in your 3D scene, you're going to have different objects or entities. And a lot of times, depending on the game or simulation, you want to clone or spawn an existing object. So, a simple example, a zombie shooter, you might have one zombie, but you can spawn more over time.
Right. And thinking, going back to showing my age and going back to the 80s, asteroids, right? You have one entity as an asteroid and then you can spawn hundreds out of those, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Or, in a business sense, it may be a widget coming down an assembly line.
Yep, that makes sense. Cool. Well, I'll let you get started. I know everybody wants to check this out. So do I. I'll jump in if I have any questions.
Okay, cool. So I'm logged into the Sumerian console here. And the first thing we're going to do, what I like to do anytime I want to learn something new or do a quick prototype, is keep it simple. I usually start with this default lighting template. And if I just click on that, it's going to ask me for a name for this new scene. So I'm going to call mine Spawner. I'll go ahead and press return. And really quickly, we're still in the web browser here. I'm using Firefox, the latest edition, and I have a default scene. If we look in the left side, we have the Entities panel, and under this parent entity called Default Lights, we have 3 different lights that are all set up for us. So our scene is kind of professionally lit at this point. And you might have noticed when I clicked on one of those lights on the right-hand side, the inspector window, I get details, and there's different components here that are showing up. That's going to become important in a moment. So at this point, we just have a scene, nothing in it. We need to create something so we can start building our little experiment. So what I'm going to do next is go to Create Entity, and at the very top row, we have 3D primitives. So for this tutorial, we're going to add a box, a sphere, and a cylinder. So let's go ahead and add the box first. You'll notice it's highlighted for us, but it's a little hard to see, so a quick tip is to press F to focus on that object, and then I'm going to use the scroll wheel just to back off a little bit so I can see it better in the scene. So we have our box. One thing I'd like you to notice is in the inspector, if I click on the transform component, we can see that it's at XYZ000, which is the origin of our scene. Just to make this a little bit simpler, to keep track of the objects as we add them into the scene, I'm going to go down to Material and change the color of this just so I can keep track of what's going on. Let's make this one green. So we're ready to add two more entities. We'll go ahead and add the cylinder next. And again, if we look at the transform, it's back at 000. So every time we add an entity into the scene, it's going to be at the origin. We have a couple of choices now when we want to reposition that entity. We could simply drag it up. And if I look at the transform, as I'm doing that, you can see the Y value move. Second option is we can click in that box and just type a value, which I'm going to do next. And let's zoom out a little bit more. The second row is called rotation. So I'm going to rotate my cylinder around the Y-axis. There we go. And let's change the color of this one to maybe a dark gray. Okay, one more entity we're going to add is the sphere. Again, it's at 000, so let's move that up. And you'll notice that these little axes are colored, so we can see the red is our x-axis. I'm going to pop that out to 1 as well. And what I've done here to pan is just hold down the right mouse button, and then I can rotate about the scene. Let's change the color to red on this one. And now we have the basics of our scene. Notice that I didn't bring in, I didn't want to spend time to go look for a model. In this case, it sort of looks like a little water gun or something like that. I didn't want to spend time looking for something, so I just quickly built what I needed. Back in the entity panel, what we can do to make this even a little bit more concrete, rather than just saying we have a box, a cylinder, and a sphere, let's add one more entity, this time just called entity, which is empty, and we can drag and drop our 3 components into it. There we are. And what that allows us to do, just thinking forward a little bit, is if we wanted to have more than one of these little objects, we could then move them all as one component. So let's go ahead and just reset that back to the origin.
Quick question on that. You're able to rename it, right, from entity to something. For example, let's say this was a gun. You can rename it to toy gun. So that way it's easier to find.
Yeah, absolutely. So we could come by highlighting it, going into the inspector. We can change the name of that. So we could call it toy gun. There we go.
And you may be covering this later on, but this also can be manipulated via scripting. What is the variable name for this? Because obviously toy gun is just a label.
Right. So entities do have a name attribute, and that would follow from the name that's given here.
Okay, so you would literally call the entity via scripting toy space gun capital, the way it is there.
Yeah, so there are some functions you can use to search for objects that are in the scene.
Okay.
Yeah. So a little bit of explanation of what we want to do next. What I want to do is to say, well, I want to actually spawn or create a new sphere, but I want to do it when an event happens. So in this little example, if I click on the box, the green box, I want to send a message into the Sumerian system. I'm going to have the cylinder listen for that message, and when it receives the message, create a clone and spawn a new sphere into the scene. So the way we're going to do that is sort of build up our little example here. So let's click on box. we're going to add a component in the inspector, and you'll notice there's a lot of options we have. We're going to add a state machine, and at this point it's saying, hey, drop a behavior here. What does that mean? We don't have any behaviors, so we'll go ahead and press the plus button to create a new behavior, and that opens up this visual state machine editor. Just minimize that guy a little bit. When we look at the state machine, it has what's called a behavior, so it's going to be listening or reacting to events, which then trigger some action in our scene. So the first thing I like to do is to change the name of the behavior so it's a little more descriptive. So we're just going to call this one start. This will start something. By default, we get an initial state called state 1. So let's go ahead and rename that state to click. If we then come down to add action, we get a lot of different choices, different categories of actions that we can wait for or respond to. The neat thing here is if we go up to the search bar, I can type in the word click, and the very first option at the top says click tap on entity, listens for a click event, and then performs a transition. So that's exactly what we want. We can either double click on that or just come down and say add, and now that added the action into that state. And we can see it down below here on click. What's going to happen when we click on that is going to happen in our next state. So we're going to transition. So if I use the left mouse button, I can wire up these two states. State, let's rename this one so it's a little more obvious what's going on. And I'm going to call this one emit start. So we want to emit a message into the Sumerian system. So let's go ahead and say add another action. Look for the keyword emit. There it is right on top. I'm going to double click this time, and now we have a parameter for this action, and it's called channel. So it's asking us to name the channel for this message. So just keeping with the naming convention I have here, start on the behavior, I'm going to call my channel also start. So at this point, we can actually go ahead and test this, right? We've got our scene that's on the canvas, the state machine editor down below. If I hit this play button in the center, it's going to play our scene. And we can see that the first state, the initial state, is highlighted in green. And when I click on the box, we transitioned to the second state. So that's showing us already that something's happening here, something's working. We didn't see the message, but we can see the transition occur. One thing, however, now is if we start clicking on the box, nothing else is going to happen. So we need to finish off this state machine. So let's go ahead and stop it. And what we want to do is actually add a second action to our emit state. Because we'll notice that we want to actually transition back to the first state. So there's this handy action called transition that does exactly that. Again, left click and wire back to the first. Now if we hit play, I'm clicking it multiple times. We don't actually see this second one get highlighted because it's occurring so quickly. It's coming to emit and then right back to the click state. But this is looking better. So let's hit stop and go to our next step.
Real quick, so this emit start is almost like you're setting a global variable or a message that the entire system in this scene can listen for, right? So any object,
Exactly.
So if you have 100 objects here, you can literally have 20, 30 objects saying, hey, if I hear start, then I want you to do something.
Right. That's exactly right. So you might have an object that's waiting for someone to press the start button on a scene, and that might kick off some background
A bunch of
music.
objects or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. Okay, cool.
Okay. So now just to review quickly, so we're going to emit that message into the system. We're going to have the cylinder listen to it and clone or spawn spheres. So let's go to our cylinder. And what we're going to do here is create our clone behavior. So just like we just did, let's create a new state machine. By the way, if we look on the lower left, you'll see this assets panel, and this is showing all of the assets that are currently in our scene. So if we come down and look at filtered by behaviors, we can see that we have the start behavior that we just created. If we wanted to, we could drag that over here. It wouldn't give us the desired output. So what we're going to do is create a new one. But I just wanted to show you that as you create things, they will show up in this asset panel.
But the cool part about that, I guess, is that you can create a behavior, sort of a global behavior, right, that you can reuse in multiple places.
That's right. Yep. And it actually goes a little bit further. In the very bottom left here, we see create pack. So you can actually create a new asset pack and then use that in other scenes entirely.
That includes a whole bunch of behaviors. So you don't have to redo this constantly.
Right.
Yep.
And that pack can have, scripts and
right. Materials, and
textures, whatever you need.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool.
Okay, so now we're looking at the cylinder behavior. I'm going to call this one clone. And the first state, rather than performing the click, like you just mentioned, we're going to listen now for a message. So I'm going to call that state listen. Add the action. And again, it's really handy to just look for keywords. So I'm going to say listen. We don't want to listen on the DOM. We're going to pick the second one. Perform a transition on receiving a system bus message on a specific channel. So let's double click that. Same wording as the emit message. We want to know which channel. So it's really important that we get the same spelling and case. So anytime we hear the start channel, a message on the start channel, that's going to transition to a new state.
So capital S would not, if you typed in start with a capital S, it wouldn't work, right? Because it was looking for lowercase s?
That's correct, yeah.
I see. So it's really important, I guess, for us developers to come up with standards on channels so you can kind of remember what you've named it, right?
That's true, yeah. Mm-hmm. So in our case, when we get that start event, we're going to transition to a new state. And let me highlight that one so we can see it in the inspector. And now what we actually want to do is, what do we want to do once we hear that? We want to clone the sphere. So I'm going to call this state clone. I'm going to go look in our actions. I'm going to hope and type in clone. Now in this case, there is no action available called clone. So we're going to have to do a little bit of work here. So even though we're using this visual sort of front end for the state machine, we're actually going to execute our own script. So the action will be execute script, and the parameters here look different. Once again, it's saying drop script. We can load a script if we have it on our computer, or we can just create a new one. So once again, if I went over and looked at my assets, I could filter on scripts. Currently none exist, so let's go ahead and create a new one. We have a lot of options here for the type of script we're doing. Some of these are pre-built. In fact, all of them are pre-built except for the very top one called custom, and that's what we want to use. So I've got custom, and not much happens. It's like, okay, you have a new script. Next, go to that little pencil icon and say, now we want to edit the script. So very cool. We stay within the web browser, got a new tab open, and we're in the script editor. First recommendation is to say, let's rename the script so we know later when we're looking at it what its function is. I'm going to call the script clone. And what we see is a template for a script. And there's a bunch of functions or hooks that the Sumerian engine is going to call for us. Some of these get called once, like setup, and others get called every time there's an update to the scene. For example, fixed update. So what we're going to do is use some of these hooks. Some of them we won't care about because we're actually calling this script from a state machine. So what I'm going to do is actually just simplify this and remove these three in the middle. Just go ahead and delete them. And I've got a couple macros set up here, so I'm going to replace the setup script with something nice and simple. It's simply an array called clones. Now, one quick thing is the CTX stands for context, and that's a way for us to store data in Sumerian. So my script later can access this clones array.
So that means it's accessible throughout the entire scene?
Not in this case. There's actually different visibility levels. So there's also context.entity data and context.world data. So if we had put in world data.clones, that would be available to other scripts within the entire scene.
I see. So this is available only to this script, or to the object that's using this script.
Right.
Got it.
Yep. Now, what we want to do when we enter our script is really the meat of what's going to go on here. So let me replace that with some code, and we'll see what's going on. So Sumerian is one of these globals. You'll see up top it even tells us it's the global object for the game engine or for the engine. It has some helper function called entity utils and clone. So we can take an entity and clone it using this. So that's really great. Once we've cloned an object, I'm going to push it onto my clones array, do a little bit of debug here, just log out to the console that I've created a new clone, give it a unique name, and set a tag on it called clone. This section here is just going to give it a random color to make it a little more visible to us.
So you're giving it a name called clone plus the number. So it'll be clone 1, clone 2, clone 3. What's the tag for?
The tag is going to be used by an upcoming script that's going to actually animate the sphere for us.
I see. Oh, and this will animate all the clones with that tag.
Yeah,
I see.
we don't want to touch the original sphere. So I'll show you in a moment what that looks like in the inspector.
Perfect.
And we've given it a random color. We'll add it to the world and transition in the state machine to success. So let's just finish this off. There's one important bit here. We've got exit. Again, this is just some debugging to say I've left that entity. In our cleanup function, we're going to iterate through the array of clones and just remove each one from the world. This last little bit is really important, called parameters. So what I've done here, if we come back and look at the clone helper function, I'm saying I want to clone args.entity. Well, where is that coming from? It's coming from this parameter. So let's save this and see what it looks like back in the IDE. By the way, when you save, make sure that you see that there's no errors in your script. So here we are. Now we're back in the execute script, and you'll notice that we have entity to clone, drop entity. What I can do is simply grab that sphere and drop it right on top. We can see from our script, we have script success. So I'm going to go back to the listen function so we can do this action more and more times. Now, regarding that tag clone, if I click on the original sphere, we have this tag section, and by default, entities don't have any tags. You can have one or more tags and use those maybe later in a function or in a state machine to look for objects and give them sort of unique behaviors.
And the main reason you didn't add a tag to the original entity is why?
I want that to stay in place.
I see. So it always stays in the middle there. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So we're almost done, but I'd like to sort of check things as I go, right? Rather than try to do the whole thing and then hope for the best at the end. So let's hit play and see what's going on. And I've got the clone behavior. We're listening for the start event. So let's go ahead and click the box. So something happened, right? We've got a different color now. If I click again, different color, and it sort of looks striped, kind of odd. So what's going on is, if I bring up the console log, we can see that we are indeed creating clones. The problem is they're all at the same location as the original, right? So just to make it a little more visible, let's add one more script. We'll stop our scene, go over to sphere.
And by the way, the log you brought up, that's not a Sumerian log. That's just the browser log.
That's correct.
Yeah, the console from the browser. Yeah.
The console.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So now on the sphere itself, we want to sort of move this thing along so we can see it better when we add new spheres to our scene. So what we're going to do, rather than adding a state machine, I'm just going to directly add script. And once again, we do have a script, but it's performing the wrong function, so we're going to have to create a new one, a new custom script. We'll go ahead and edit that. So we'll come back to our second tab over here. Let's rename this one, and I'm going to call this one move. Now this is actually a pretty small script, so what I'm going to do is just remove everything from here and bring in the new script, and we can talk about that quickly. So in our setup function, just going to log to the console to say, hey, this thing is here. We have fixed update. This is kind of the important bit. Every time Sumerian Engine is going to refresh the scene, like a new frame, we want to take an entity that has a tag called clone, only the clones, and we're going to add some translation to them. The translation itself is going to come from one of these design time parameters. So let me hit save on that, make sure we have no errors. Go back over here, and now we can see our design time parameters. And what I want to do is, since it sort of looks like the sphere is moving on the x-axis here, let's just give it a little bit of a positive update each time the frame, each time the scene updates. So there we are. And let's get rid of that so we can see what's going on a little better. Zoom out.
So I have a question for you on this. Yeah. I guess I'm trying to guess before it happens to see if I understand this correctly. But you start at 000. When you clone it, then it goes to 0.100. But then when you clone, you're cloning the original, or you're cloning the one that's at 0.1, so then it'll go to 0.2.
Yeah, so what's actually happening, if we're looking at the original sphere, and if we look at the transform, so it's starting at position 110. When we do the clones are going to also be at 110. And what's going to happen in the script is every time there's a new frame, it's going to add 0.1 to the X value.
I see.
So over time, it's going to move further away from us.
Right. Okay. Makes sense.
So let's go ahead and press play and see if it's all working as we hope. All right. So we're ready. Let's click on the green box. There we go. And that's just going to continue forever, that clone. But if I click a few more times, we get as many as we like.
I see. So they always start at the original where the entity is. And what it's doing for every frame draw, it's actually just adding the translation, basically. So that'll continue on forever.
Yep. Yep. So I think we're working as expected. You can definitely see where this might go. Like, rather than just adding a translation, we might start thinking about colliders and physics. And, you know, if that's like a water gun that we have, and that's a drop of water, we'd want that to animate correctly, and maybe when it collides with a target, have it splatter, maybe add some sound effects, etc. But this is kind of the beginning of how you would take something, clone it, or spawn more of those clones into a scene.
That's pretty cool stuff. Yeah, I could see a million ways you can use this, coming more from an enterprise/training perspective. I mean, there's so much you can do with this.
Yeah. Now, the very final step is to actually say, well, I want to share this with somebody. So in the top right, there's this little publish drop down. And what you do is just press create public link, publish. We can then copy that URL, open up a new tab. And there we are. We've got something that we can immediately send out to anybody. They can go play with that scene, give feedback to us. We can iterate on the scene and continually improve it.
That's very cool. Now, are you going to leave that URL public so other people can try it out just to see how it works?
Sure, we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then for the future, like a year from now, if you're watching this tutorial and you go to that link and it's no longer there, well, it's been a year, so.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's very cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense how this works. And the other thing is, of course, you're not going to be able to see it in the HMD, right? Because you haven't put in the VR pack into the Sumerian scene yet for people to go in.
That's correct.
Yeah, and we'll do that in another tutorial. How do you do that? But this is more just how to create spawners.
Yep. Yeah, and one very final thing is if I bring back the browser console, you can see, like in this case, we've got 11 clones. We can't even see them. They're very far away from us at this point. But if I stop the scene, actually I misspoke. Let me clear that off. Let's play this one again. Sort of walk through this. So every time we click, we're adding more clones. When I stop the scene, we can see that we've cleaned up properly. We've taken them out of the world.
And maybe you can clarify, why is it important to take them out of the world?
It's just basic memory management is a big thing. We don't want to have memory leaks in our scene and have the scene degrade over time, the performance of it. So it's always a good idea to clean things up when you no longer need them.
Yep, perfect. Well, very cool, Kirby. This was extremely educational. I mean, I could see so many uses for this. So thank you so much for presenting this tutorial and being so clear about it. I mean, you've took us through every single step. So there's many more questions that I could throw at you, but maybe we'll leave them for another tutorial.
Yeah, sounds good.
So if people want to get a hold of you, do you want to give them your email or website, whatever you like?
Sure. Twitter's a good way to go. It's my name, Kirby Shabaga. I'm not sure if you can put that up after.
I will. We'll put it in the show notes.
Oh, I was just going to say, just sort of reiterate what you mentioned at the beginning, that the Slack group for the Sumerian project is a great way to get in touch with me as well.
We'll put that in the show notes as well, so that way people know how to get into the Slack channel.
Yeah, sounds good.
Well, thanks again, Kirby, and to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with us. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and remember to click on that subscribe button so that I can get more guests for this tutorial series. If you are ever in the Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great VR, AR, and MR presentations. You can join or RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. Finally, if you are interested in learning more about how to create VR, AR, and MR experiences, please visit howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.